There are moments in life when a single decision splits your world in two. Before and after, safety and danger, invisible and seen. For Maria Alvarez, that moment came on a Tuesday morning, holding a stranger's phone in her trembling hands, staring at a name that could either save a life or end hers. The name on the screen read simply, Papa. But in the city of San Pedro, everyone knew there was only one man whose son would have that name saved in his contacts with such casual intimacy, such dangerous simplicity. Don Alessandro Moretti, the Mafia boss who made politicians sweat, who made police commissioners look the other way, who built an empire on fear and blood and absolute control. And Maria, a 24-year-old maid who earned $7 a day scrubbing his marble floors, was about to call him. But let's go back. Let's go back to before the phone call, before the blood, before everything changed. Because you need to understand who Maria was in the before, so you can see just how far the after would take her. Maria Alvarez woke every morning at 4:30 in a room so small you could touch both walls if you stretched your arms wide. The paint peeled in the corners like old skin, and the single window looked out onto a brick wall so close you could count the cracks. She shared this room with two other girls, both maids like her, both from villages with names nobody in the city remembered. They worked in different houses, for different masters, but they all understood the same truth. In San Pedro, girls like them were ghosts seen but not noticed, present but not acknowledged, alive but not living. Maria's routine never changed. Cold water from a shared tap, a piece of bread saved from yesterday, a prayer whispered so quietly even God had to lean in to hear it. Then the walk through streets still dark, past alleys where dangerous men counted money and made plans, past corners where girls younger than her sold things they could never get back, past the invisible line that separated the slums from the hills, where the real city began, where people like Don Alessandro Moretti lived in houses that could swallow her entire neighborhood. The Moretti mansion sat behind iron gates 15 feet high, topped with spikes that caught the morning light like teeth. Maria had worked there for 8 months, and in those 8 months, she had perfected the art of being invisible. She kept her eyes down. She never spoke unless spoken to. She moved through rooms like smoke, cleaning, polishing, erasing any trace of disorder, then disappearing before anyone could remember she'd been there at all. The other servants had taught her the rules on her first day. Rule 1, Don Alessandro doesn't tolerate mistakes. Rule 2, Don Alessandro doesn't give second chances. Rule 3, if Don Alessandro notices you, pray it's not for the wrong reason. Maria had seen what happened when someone broke the rules. 3 months ago, a young man named Carlos had dropped a crystal decanter, a family heirloom from Sicily, and it shattered across the study floor like 1,000 tiny diamonds. Don Alessandro had been in the next room. The sound brought him to the doorway, and Maria, polishing silver in the corner, had watched as the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Alessandro hadn't yelled. He hadn't even raised his voice. He'd simply looked at Carlos with those dark, unreadable eyes and said 2 words, "You're done." Carlos was escorted out by 2 men in black suits, and nobody saw him again. Nobody asked. Asking questions was another way to get noticed, and getting noticed was the fastest way to disappear. So Maria kept her head down and her hands busy. She scrubbed floors until her knees ached. She polished chandeliers while standing on ladders that swayed. She washed windows so clean they became invisible, just like her. And every Friday, she took her meager pay, cash in a plain envelope, no name, no record, and sent every single bill to her mother in the village of Santa Rosa, 3 hours south, where the hospital bills were piling up faster than prayers could push them down. Her mother had diabetes, the kind that ate you slowly from the inside, the kind that required insulin and medication and doctor visits that cost more than a year of Maria's wages. But Maria sent what she could, and she prayed it would be enough. And she told herself that 3 more months of invisibility, 3 more months of silence, 3 more months of surviving in the shadow of a monster would buy her mother another year of life. She never imagined that compassion could be more dangerous than any mistake. It was a Tuesday, her day off, and Maria had walked to the market before dawn to buy bread and milk, the cheapest breakfast she could manage. The paper bag was already tearing at the bottom, and she held it carefully like a baby, because losing even one item meant going hungry. The streets were emptier than usual, that strange quiet that settles over a city when even the criminals are still asleep. She was thinking about her mother, about the last phone call where her voice had sounded weaker, thinner, like she was already halfway to somewhere else. She was thinking about money and medicine and miracles. She wasn't thinking about the alley, but then she saw him, a young man, maybe 22 or 23, collapsed against the wall like a puppet with cut strings. His clothes were expensive, designer jeans, a leather jacket that probably cost more than Maria made in 6 months, shoes so clean they still reflected the streetlight, but his face told a different story. Blood crusted around his nose and mouth. One eye swollen shut, purple and angry. His breathing was shallow, rattling, wrong. Maria's first instinct was to keep walking. This was San Pedro. Bodies in alleys were someone else's problem. Getting involved meant getting noticed, and getting noticed meant danger. But then he made a sound, a small, broken sound, like a child trying not to cry, and Maria stopped. She looked around. The street was empty, no cars, no witnesses. Just her and this dying boy, and the choice between who she was and who the city wanted her to be. She set down her groceries, the bag finally tearing, milk spilling across the pavement like spilled moonlight, and she knelt beside him. Her hands shook as she checked his pulse. Weak but there. She pulled out her phone, the cheap one with the cracked screen, and dialed for an ambulance. The line rang 4 times before a bored voice answered and told her it would be 45 minutes, maybe more, and hung up before she could beg 45 minutes. He didn't have 45 minutes. She looked at his face, really looked, and something about him seemed familiar. The shape of his jaw, the dark hair, the expensive watch on his wrist still ticking, still counting down the seconds he had left. She'd seen him before. Where? Then it hit her like cold water. The mansion. She'd seen his photograph on the mantle in Don Alessandro's private study, the one room she was only allowed to clean when he wasn't home. The photograph of a young man in a graduation gown, smiling, one arm around his father's shoulders. The only picture in the entire mansion where Alessandro Moretti was smiling. This was Luca, Alessandro's son, his only child, his heir, and he was dying in Maria's arms. That's when the phone rang. It was in his jacket pocket, vibrating against her hand like a trapped bird. She pulled it out, and the screen lit up with a name that made her blood turn to ice. Papa. Just that. Papa. With a photo, Alessandro Moretti, stern and powerful, staring at the camera like he could see through it, through the phone, through time itself, directly into Maria's terrified soul. Her finger hovered over the screen. Every instinct screamed at her to drop the phone, to run, to disappear back into the safety of invisibility. If she answered, Alessandro would know she was involved. He might think she did this. He might think she was part of whatever gang or rival family had beaten his son and left him to die. He might kill her just for being a witness, but if she didn't answer, Luca would die. And somehow in that moment, Maria realized that 8 months of invisibility had cost her something essential. She'd become so good at disappearing that she'd almost forgotten how to be human. She answered the call. Who is this? The voice was exactly as she remembered from the few times she'd heard him speak in the mansion. Deep, cold, sharp enough to cut. A voice that didn't ask questions. It demanded answers. Sir, Maria stammered, her voice barely a whisper. I'm Maria Alvarez. I work for you. I'm a maid. I will clean your house. She was babbling, panicking, making her words tumble over each other. She forced herself to breathe. I found your son. Luca. He's hurt. He's unconscious. He's in an alley on Calle Tercera, near the old church. He's bleeding and I called an ambulance, but they said 45 minutes, and I don't think he has 45 minutes, and I don't know what to do, but I couldn't just leave him and... Stop! One word she stopped. Silence on the other end, but not empty silence. The kind of silence where you can hear someone thinking, calculating, deciding whether you live or die. Then, stay with him. Don't move. Don't let anyone near him. I'm coming. The line went dead, Maria stared at the phone, then at Luca, then at the empty street that suddenly felt like a stage where something terrible was about to happen. She should run. Every survival instinct told her to run, but she'd made her choice when she answered that phone. She couldn't go back to being invisible now. So she did the only thing she could think of. She took off her shawl, the one her mother had made for her before she left the village, the one that still smelled like home, and she wrapped it around Luca's shoulders. She pulled his head into her lap, trying to keep him warm, trying to keep him alive, trying to keep herself from shaking so hard her teeth rattled. She prayed. Not the formal prayers from church, but the desperate kind, the bargaining kind. Please, God, don't let him die. Please don't let this be a mistake. Please let me see my mother again. 7 minutes later, she heard them. The cars came fast, black SUVs with tinted windows, tires screaming as they rounded the corner. 3 of them forming a barrier around the alley, blocking both ends. Doors opened in perfect synchronization, and men poured out, men in dark suits with hard faces and harder eyes, men carrying guns they didn't bother to hide. They moved like soldiers, like a machine, securing the perimeter, checking rooftops, checking shadows. And then from the center vehicle, he emerged. Don Alessandro Moretti. Maria had seen him before, of course, in the mansion, moving through rooms like a king through his castle, trailed by advisors and bodyguards in fear. But she'd never been this close. Never seen him like this, without the distance of marble floors and formal rooms between them. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with broad shoulders that filled his tailored suit like a threat. His hair was dark, touched with gray at the temples, slicked back in a way that suggested control, precision, power. His face was all sharp angles, strong jaw, high cheekbones, a nose that had been broken at least once and healed slightly crooked, which somehow made him more dangerous, not less. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath, dark brown, almost black, and completely unreadable. Eyes that had seen terrible things and done worse. Eyes that could look at you and decide your worth in a single glance. Those eyes found her now, kneeling in the alley, cradling his son, her cheap dress stained with blood and spilled milk, her shawl wrapped around Luca like a shield. Alessandro moved toward her, and his men parted like water. He didn't run. Men like him didn't run. But each step was purposeful, controlled, like a predator approaching prey. Maria couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She was a rabbit in the shadow of a hawk, and all she could do was wait for the strike. He stopped 3 feet away, looking down at her, at his son. For a moment, nothing. No expression, no emotion. Just that terrible, calculating silence. Then he knelt, and suddenly they were eye level, and Maria could see something she hadn't expected. Fear. Just a flicker, just a crack in the armor. But it was there. He reached out and touched Luca's face, checking his pulse, his breathing, his injuries, and his hands. Hands that had killed, hands that had built an empire on violence, were gentle. What happened? His voice was quieter now, but no less dangerous. I don't know, Maria said, and she was surprised her voice worked at all. I found him like this. I think he was beaten. I called an ambulance, but how long ago? Maybe 10 minutes. I called you right away. I didn't know what else to do. Alessandro looked at her then, really looked at her, and Maria felt like he was reading her entire life in that single glance. Her fear, her poverty, her desperation, her honesty. Something shifted in his expression, something she couldn't name. You stayed with him, he said. Not a question, an observation. I couldn't leave him. Why not? The question caught her off guard. Why not? Because leaving someone to die was wrong. Because she'd been raised to help people, even when it cost her. Because invisibility had made her small, but it hadn't made her cruel. But she didn't know how to say any of that to a man like Alessandro Moretti. So she said the only thing that felt true. Because he's someone's son. Something happened to Alessandro's face. Then the armor cracked a little wider. He stared at her for a long moment, and Maria couldn't tell if she'd said the right thing or signed her own death warrant. Then he stood, barking orders in Italian to his men. 2 of them moved forward with a stretcher, carefully lifting Luca, and within seconds he was in one of the SUVs, and a man who looked like a doctor was already working on him, checking vitals, starting an IV. Alessandro turned back to Maria, still kneeling in the alley, still shaking, still wearing her fear like a second skin. "Get in the car," he said. It wasn't a request. Maria stood on legs that felt like water. One of the men opened the door of the second SUV and she climbed in, her mind screaming at her to run, but her body obeying, because what else could she do? Alessandro slid in beside her, and the door closed with a sound like a coffin sealing. The car started moving, following the one carrying Luca, and Maria pressed herself against the opposite door, trying to make herself small again, trying to disappear. "You work in my house," Alessandro said. Not a question. "Yes, sir. 8 months. I clean the East Wing mostly, and the library, and sometimes the... I don't remember you." Of course he didn't. That was the point. "I try to stay out of the way, sir." He looked at her, and there was something almost curious in his expression. "You called me. You could have walked away. You could have let him die and no one would have known you were there. Why didn't you?" Maria didn't know how to answer that, because the truth was complicated. Because she'd been invisible for so long, she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to matter. Because in that moment, seeing Luca broken and bleeding, she'd remembered that before she was a maid, before she was poor, before she was invisible, she was human, and humans didn't leave each other to die in alleys. "I don't know," she whispered. Alessandro studied her for a long moment, then turned to look out the window. "You saved my son's life today. That means something." Maria didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. The car drove through the city, through neighborhoods that got progressively cleaner, richer, safer, until they reached the mansion. But instead of stopping at the servants' entrance, they drove straight to the main house. The gates opened, and they pulled into a circular driveway where men in white coats were already waiting with a gurney. Luca was transferred with military efficiency, carried into the house, and Alessandro followed. Moving with that same controlled urgency, Maria sat in the car, unsure if she was supposed to follow or wait or run. Then one of the men opened her door. "The Don wants you inside," he said. So she followed. Through the front doors she'd never been allowed to use. Across the marble foyer she'd scrubbed 100 times but never walked across. Up the grand staircase to the second floor, to a wing of the house she'd never seen. They stopped outside a bedroom, Luca's, she assumed, and Alessandro stood in the doorway, watching the doctor work. Maria hung back, trying to be invisible again, but Alessandro turned and saw her. "Come here," he said. She approached, and he gestured to a chair beside the bed. "Sit with him. He shouldn't be alone when he wakes up." "Sir, That wasn't a request." So Maria sat, and Alessandro stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her, watching his son, and then he left, his footsteps echoing down the hallway like thunder. Maria sat in that chair for 6 hours. The doctor came and went. Nurses checked vitals. Men in suits whispered in corners. And Maria stayed, because she'd been told to, because she didn't know what else to do, because somehow in the span of a single morning, her entire life had been turned inside out. She thought about her mother. She thought about her room with the peeling paint. She thought about invisibility and safety and the price of being seen. And she wondered if answering that phone call had saved Luca's life or ended hers. When Luca finally opened his eyes, the sun was setting, painting the room in shades of gold and amber. He blinked, confused, disoriented, and then his gaze found Maria, still sitting in the chair, still wearing her blood-stained dress, still wrapped in the fear she couldn't shake. "Who are you?" he whispered, his voice rough, broken. "Maria," she said, "I found you. In the alley." Recognition flickered across his face. "You stayed. I called your father." "They came back," Luca said, and his eyes went distant, remembering. "The men who beat me, they came back to finish it. But you were there. You stood between us. You told them the police were coming. You lied to save me." Maria's breath caught. She didn't remember that. The whole thing was a blur of fear and adrenaline. But Luca was looking at her like she was a hero, and Maria had never felt less heroic in her life. "I just did what anyone would do," she said. "No," Luca said, and his voice was firm despite the pain. "You did what no one else would. And my father knows it." Before Maria could respond, the door opened and Alessandro entered, and the air in the room changed, becoming heavier. charged with something Maria couldn't name. He looked at his son, awake and alive, and something in his expression softened, just for a moment. Just enough for Maria to see the father beneath the monster. "How do you feel?" Alessandro asked. "Like I got hit by a truck," Luca said, attempting a smile. "But alive. Because of her." Alessandro's gaze shifted to Maria, and she felt pinned by it, examined, weighed. "Leave us," he said to the others in the room. They filed out immediately, and suddenly it was just the three of them. The Mafia boss, his son, and the maid who'd made one phone call that changed everything. "Maria Alvarez," Alessandro said, and hearing her full name in his voice felt strange, like he was giving her substance, making her real. "You've done something today that very few people have ever done. You've put me in your debt." "I don't want anything, sir," Maria said quickly. "I just wanted to help." "I know," Alessandro said, and there was something almost surprising in his tone. "That's what makes you dangerous." Maria's heart stopped. Dangerous? How could she possibly be dangerous to a man like him? Alessandro seemed to read her confusion. "People in my world don't do things without expecting something in return. Loyalty is bought. Favors are traded. Trust is a currency. But you," he paused, studying her, "you helped my son because it was the right thing to do. You risked your life for a stranger. You called me knowing I could kill you for being a witness. You stayed when you could have run. That kind of goodness, Maria, is the most dangerous thing in my world, because I don't know what to do with it." Maria didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. Alessandro turned to his son. "Rest. We'll talk about who did this later." Then back to Maria. "You'll stay here tonight, in the guest wing. Tomorrow we'll discuss your new position." "New position?" Maria's voice was barely a whisper. "You saved my son's life. That means you're under my protection now, whether you want it or not." And with that, he left, leaving Maria sitting in a chair in a room she'd never been allowed to enter, beside a boy she'd saved, in a world she didn't understand, wondering if she'd been rescued or captured, because in the world of Don Alessandro Moretti, maybe they were the same thing. So here's the question I want you to think about. The question that will haunt Maria for everything that comes next. When you save a monster's son, does that make you a hero or an accomplice? When you show compassion to someone who's never known it, do you redeem them or doom yourself? And when a man who's built his entire life on fear and power looks at you and sees something he doesn't understand, something pure and good and dangerous, what happens next? Because Maria Alvarez is about to find out that in the world of the Mafia, kindness isn't weakness, it's a weapon. And she's just armed the most dangerous man in the city with something he's never had before, a reason to change. But change is violent, change is bloody, and change, in Alessandro Moretti's world, comes with a price. If you want to find out what happens next, if you want to see whether Maria's compassion will save her or destroy her, if you want to witness the moment when a Mafia boss's frozen heart begins to thaw, then hit that subscribe button right now, because this story is just beginning, and trust me, you don't want to miss what comes next. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's find out together whether love can bloom in the darkest places, or whether some men are too far gone to save the phone call changed everything. But the real question is, can one act of kindness change a man who spent his entire life believing that kindness is weakness? Stay tuned. Maria woke up in a bed softer than clouds, in a room larger than the entire apartment she shared with two other maids, staring at a ceiling painted with angels, and wondering if she'd died in that alley. And this was some kind of purgatory designed specifically for poor girls who didn't know their place. The morning light filtered through silk curtains the color of champagne, and for a disorienting moment, she forgot where she was, forgot the phone call, forgot the blood, forgot everything except the impossible softness beneath her body. Then reality crashed back like cold water, and she sat up so fast her head spun. This was the Moretti mansion. She was in the guest wing. Don Alessandro had put her here, and somewhere in this labyrinth of marble and money, a Mafia boss was deciding what to do with the maid who'd seen too much. She looked down at herself and realized someone had changed her clothes while she slept. Gone was her blood-stained dress, replaced by silk pajamas that probably cost more than she made in a month. The thought of strangers undressing her unconscious body made her skin crawl. But then she noticed her old dress folded neatly on a chair, cleaned and pressed, and somehow that small act of care made everything more confusing. Monsters didn't fold your clothes. Monsters didn't give you silk pajamas and rooms with painted ceilings. Monsters didn't look at their sons with fear and relief, and something that looked almost like love. So what did Alessandro Moretti do? And more importantly, what did it make her to be here? A knock at the door made her jump. Before she could answer, it opened, and an older woman entered carrying a tray of food that smelled like heaven. She was maybe 60, with steel gray hair pulled into a tight bun and eyes that had seen everything and judged most of it. She set the tray on the bedside table and looked at Maria with an expression somewhere between curiosity and concern. "I'm Sophia," she said. "Head cook. Been with the Moretti family for 30 years. Eat. You look like a strong wind could blow you away." Maria stared at the food. Fresh bread, butter, jam, eggs, fruit, coffee that actually steamed. And her stomach growled so loudly it echoed she hadn't eaten since the bread she'd bought yesterday. The bread that had spilled across the pavement, along with the milk in her old life. "Thank you," Maria whispered. Reaching for the coffee, Sophia didn't leave. She stood there, arms crossed, watching Maria eat with the intensity of a general surveying a battlefield. Finally, she spoke. "You're the one who saved Luca." It wasn't a question, but Maria nodded anyway. "The whole house is talking about it. The maid who called the dawn. The girl who stood between his son and the men who wanted him dead. They're calling you brave. They're calling you stupid. Some are calling you an angel. Me? I'm just trying to figure out what you are." Maria set down her coffee cup, her hands shaking slightly. "I'm just someone who couldn't walk away." "That's what worries me," Sophia said, and her voice was softer now, almost kind. "This family, this world, it doesn't reward goodness, child. It consumes it. Don Alessandro is not a good man. He's done things that would make you sick if you knew. He's built his empire on blood and fear and broken bones, and now you've caught his attention. Do you understand what that means?" Maria thought about the way Alessandro had looked at her in the car, like she was a puzzle he couldn't solve. She thought about his words. "That kind of goodness is the most dangerous thing in my world. I think it means I'm in danger," Maria said quietly. "Maybe," Sophia said. "Or maybe it means something else. I've worked for Alessandro since he was younger than Luca. I've seen him build this empire from nothing. I've seen him make men disappear for looking at him wrong. I've seen him show mercy exactly twice in 30 years. But yesterday, when he carried you into this house, when he told me to give you the best room, when he stood outside your door for 20 minutes, just watching you sleep like he was trying to understand something, I saw something I've never seen before. I saw him confused. And a confused Alessandro Moretti is either the most dangerous thing in the world or the beginning of something that might save him. I just hope you survive long enough to find out which." Before Maria could respond, Sophia turned and left, and Maria was alone again with her thoughts and her fear and a breakfast that suddenly tasted like ash. But she forced herself to eat because she didn't know when she'd get another meal. Didn't know if this was her last breakfast or her first in a new life she didn't understand. And as she ate, she thought about Sophia's words. A confused Alessandro Moretti. What did that mean? And why did the thought of confusing a monster feel more dangerous than angering one? She'd just finished eating when another knock came, and this time it was one of Alessandro's men, the tall one with the scar across his eyebrow who'd opened the car door yesterday. "The Don wants to see you," he said. "Now." Maria's heart dropped into her stomach. She looked down at the silk pajamas. "Should I change?" He said now. So Maria followed him through hallways she'd cleaned but never walked, past paintings worth more than her entire village, down staircases made of marble that caught the light like frozen waterfalls, until they reached a door made of dark wood carved with symbols she didn't recognize. The man knocked twice, and a voice from inside said, "Enter." The study was exactly as Maria remembered from the few times she'd been allowed to clean it. Dark wood, leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with volumes in Italian and English, and languages she couldn't identify. But now in the morning light, it felt different, less like a room and more like a throne room, a place where decisions were made and fates were sealed. And behind the massive desk sat Alessandro Moretti, dressed in a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle and marked with scars that told stories Maria probably didn't want to know. He was reading something, a file of some kind, and he didn't look up when she entered. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Maria sat, her hands folded in her lap, trying to make herself small again, trying to remember how to be invisible. But Alessandro looked up then, and his dark eyes found hers, and she knew invisibility was no longer an option. "Maria Alvarez," he said, reading from the file. 24 years old, born in Santa Rosa. Father deceased, died in a construction accident when you were 12. Mother, Elena Alvarez, 52, diabetic, currently in Santa Rosa General Hospital. You send her 90% of your wages. You've worked 7 jobs in the last 3 years, all domestic work, all for wealthy families. No criminal record, no debts, no vices. You don't drink, don't smoke, don't gamble. You go to church every Sunday when you have the day off. You're exactly what you appear to be. A good girl trying to save her mother." He closed the file and looked at her. "Which makes you either the most genuine person I've ever met or the best actress in San Pedro. I'm trying to decide which." Maria's throat was dry. "I'm not acting, sir. That's what an actress would say." But there was no malice in his voice, just that same curiosity, that same confusion Sophia had mentioned. He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Do you know what happened to my son? He was beaten, that's all I know. He was beaten by members of the Volkov Syndicate Russian Mafia. They've been trying to move into my territory for 6 months. I've been pushing back. So they decided to send a message by going after Luca. They grabbed him outside his university, beat him until he couldn't stand, and left him in that alley to die. They wanted me to find him like that. They wanted me to know they could touch my family." His voice was calm, controlled, but Maria could hear the rage underneath, like a fire burning behind ice. "But you found him first, and according to Luca, when the men came back to finish the job, you stood between them and my son. You told them the police were coming. You lied to save him. Why?" Maria didn't remember doing that. The whole thing was a blur, but she tried to imagine it. The men returning, seeing her there, and what would she have done? "I couldn't let them kill him. You could have run. I could have, but I didn't. Why not?" It was the same question he'd asked in the car, and Maria still didn't have a good answer. So she told him the truth, the only truth she had. "Because running would have meant living with the knowledge that I let someone die when I could have helped, and I don't think I could live with that." Alessandro stared at her for a long moment, and Maria felt like she was being dissected, examined, weighed and measured against some standard she didn't understand. Then he stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the gardens where Maria had once spent an entire day trimming hedges into perfect shapes. "I've spent my entire life in a world where loyalty is bought, where trust is a weakness, where showing compassion gets you killed. I've built my empire on the principle that fear is more reliable than love, that power is more valuable than kindness, and it's worked. I'm the most feared man in this city. Politicians answer my calls. Police look the other way. Rival families know that crossing me means death. I've created order through chaos, peace through violence, and I've never questioned it because questioning means weakness, and weakness means death." He turned to face her. "But then you appear, a maid, nobody, someone with nothing to gain and everything to lose, and you save my son not because you want something from me, not because you're afraid of me, but because it's the right thing to do. And now I'm standing here wondering if I've built my entire life on a lie." Maria didn't know what to say to that. What do you say to a monster who's just admitted he might be wrong? Alessandro walked back to his desk, but he didn't sit. He stood there, hands braced on the wood, looking at her with an intensity that made her want to disappear. "I'm going to offer you a choice, Maria. You can leave, right now. I'll have my men drive you home. I'll pay your mother's medical bills for the next year. I'll make sure you're taken care of. You can go back to your life, and we'll never speak of this again. Or," he paused, "you can stay. Luca is recovering, but he's vulnerable. The Volkovs know they hurt him. They might try again. I need someone I can trust to watch over him, someone who isn't part of my world, someone they won't suspect. You've already proven you'll protect him. I'm asking you to do it again. But if you stay, you need to understand something. You'll be entering my world. You'll see things you can't unsee. You'll be part of something dark and dangerous. And once you're in, there's no going back to invisible. So choose carefully." Maria's mind raced. Leave and be safe, or stay and be, what? Protected? Trapped? Changed? She thought about her mother, about the medical bills that would be paid. She thought about Luca, young and broken and vulnerable. She thought about Alessandro, standing there offering her a choice when men like him didn't usually offer choices. They gave orders. And she thought about Sophia's words. A confused Alessandro Moretti is either the most dangerous thing in the world or the beginning of something that might save him. Could she save him? Did she even want to? Or was she just a poor girl so desperate for purpose that she'd convinced herself compassion could change a monster? "If I stay," Maria said slowly, "I'm not doing it for money. I'm doing it because Luca shouldn't have to be afraid in his own home. And because," she hesitated, then pushed forward, "because I think maybe you're not as terrible as you believe you are." Something flickered across Alessandro's face. Surprise? Pain? Hope? It was gone before Maria could identify it. "Then you're more naive than I thought," he said, but his voice was softer. "You'll stay in the guest wing. You'll be with Luca during the day, helping him recover. My men will protect you both, and Maria..." He looked at her with those dark, unreadable eyes. "Don't mistake my gratitude for safety. This world will try to destroy you, and I might not be able to stop it." "I understand," Maria said, even though she didn't, not really, know. Alessandro said quietly, "You don't, but you will." And that's how Maria Alvarez, a maid from the slums who'd spent 8 months perfecting invisibility, became the personal caretaker of a mafia heir, and the unwitting catalyst for a war that would reshape the entire city. But she didn't know that yet. All she knew was that she'd made a choice, and choices once made have a way of taking on lives of their own. The next 3 days passed in a strange blur of luxury and tension. Maria spent her mornings with Luca, helping him eat, changing his bandages, listening to him talk about his life, his dreams. His complicated relationship with his father, Luca, was different from what she'd expected. He was kind, funny, self-aware in a way that seemed impossible for someone raised in this world. He told her about his mother who died when he was 10, killed by a rival family in a car bomb meant for Alessandro. He told her about growing up in the shadow of violence, about wanting to be different but not knowing how. And he told her about the night he was beaten, about the men who'd laughed while they broke his ribs, about the moment he'd thought he was going to die, and his only regret was that he'd never really lived. "You saved my life," Luca said on the 3rd day, his voice stronger now, his bruises fading from purple to yellow. "But more than that, you reminded me that there are still good people in the world. I'd forgotten that. Living here, in this house, in this family, you start to think everyone is like us. Everyone is violent or corrupt or broken, but you're not. And that gives me hope." Maria didn't feel hopeful. She felt trapped in a gilded cage, watched constantly by men with guns, living in a world where every conversation felt like a test she didn't know she was taking. But she smiled at Luca because he needed hope, and if she could give him that, maybe her choice to stay wasn't completely foolish. The afternoons were different. Alessandro would appear, always unannounced, always watching. He'd stand in the doorway of Luca's room and observe Maria working, and she could feel his eyes on her like a physical weight. Sometimes he'd ask questions about her mother, her childhood, her dreams, simple questions that felt like interrogations. And Maria would answer honestly because she didn't know how to lie, and because something about Alessandro's attention made her want to be seen, really seen. For the first time in her life one afternoon, He asked her about faith. "You pray," he said. It wasn't a question. "I've seen you. Before meals, before sleeping. Even when you think no one is watching. What are you praying for?" Maria considered lying, but what was the point? "I pray for my mother. For Luca. For you. For me?" He looked genuinely surprised. "Why would you pray for me?" "Because everyone deserves prayers, even people who think they don't." Alessandro stared at her for a long moment, and Maria saw something crack in his expression, something vulnerable and raw. "I stopped believing in God the day my wife died. I prayed for her, begged, promised anything, and she died anyway, screaming, burning, while I watched and couldn't save her. So tell me, Maria, what kind of God allows that?" Maria didn't have an answer. She'd asked herself the same question when her father died, when her mother got sick, when she'd spent nights hungry and cold and wondering if anyone was listening. But she'd kept praying anyway, not because she had answers, but because prayer was the only thing that made her feel less alone. "I don't know," she said quietly, "but I think maybe God doesn't stop bad things from happening. Maybe he just helps us survive them." Alessandro looked at her like she'd said something profound, or maybe just something he desperately wanted to believe. Then he left without another word, and Maria was alone with Luca, who was watching her with knowing eyes. "He likes you," Luca said. "He doesn't even know me." "That's why he likes you. You're a mystery, and my father has spent his whole life solving mysteries and eliminating threats. But you're neither. You're just good, and he doesn't know what to do with that." Maria thought about that conversation later, lying in her too-soft bed, staring at the painted angels on the ceiling. Did Alessandro like her? Or was she just a curiosity, a puzzle to solve before he got bored and sent her back to invisibility? And why did the thought of him liking her make her heart race with something that felt dangerously close to hope? She got her answer on the fourth night. Maria woke to the sound of gunfire. Not close, but not far either. Somewhere in the mansion, glass was shattering, men were shouting, and the world was exploding into chaos. She sat up, heart pounding, and before she could process what was happening, her door burst open and one of Alessandro's men grabbed her arm. "We're under attack. Volkov's. We need to move you to the safe room. Now." But Maria pulled away. "Luca, where's Luca?" "He's being moved. You need to." "I need to be with him. That's my job. That's why I'm here." The man looked torn between following orders and arguing with her. But Maria was already running, barefoot, in her silk pajamas, down the hallway toward Luca's room. She could hear the gunfire getting closer, could smell smoke, could feel the fear rising in her throat like bile. But she kept running because Luca was alone and scared, and she'd promised to protect him. She burst into his room and found him trying to get out of bed, his face pale, his hands shaking. "Maria, you need to get out of here." "Not without you." She helped him up, supporting his weight, and they stumbled toward the door. But before they could reach it, it opened, and Maria's blood turned to ice. 3 men stood there. Not Alessandro's men. These were different, harder, colder, with accents that turned their words into weapons. Volkov's, and they were smiling. "Well, well," the tallest one said in heavily accented English. "The little maid who thinks she's a hero, and the boss's son. This is better than we hoped." Maria stepped in front of Luca, her body a shield, her mind racing. No weapons, no training, no way out. Just her and a half-healed boy and 3 men who'd come to finish what they started. But she'd stood between Luca and death once before, and she'd do it again, even if it killed her. "You'll have to go through me," she said, and her voice only shook a little. The men laughed. "That's the plan, sweetheart." The tallest one stepped forward, and Maria braced herself for pain, for death, for the end of her short, invisible life. But then the window exploded inward, and Alessandro Moretti came through it like an avenging angel, gun in one hand, fury in his eyes, and suddenly the room was full of violence and blood, and the sound of Maria screaming. It was over in seconds. 3 shots, 3 bodies. Alessandro standing in the center of the carnage, breathing hard, his white shirt splattered with red, his eyes wild and dangerous and locked on Maria. "Are you hurt?" His voice was rough, desperate. Maria shook her head, unable to speak, unable to process what she'd just seen. Alessandro crossed the room in 3 strides and grabbed her shoulders, his hand surprisingly gentle despite the violence still humming through his body. "Did they touch you?" "No, we're okay. We're—" Her voice broke, and suddenly she was shaking, the adrenaline draining away and leaving only terror in its wake. Alessandro pulled her against his chest, one arm around her, the other still holding his gun, and Maria could hear his heart pounding, could feel the heat of him, could smell gunpowder and expensive cologne, and something else, something that felt like safety even though it shouldn't. "You're safe," he murmured into her hair. "I've got you. You're safe." And Maria, who'd spent her entire life being strong, being invisible, being the one who saved others, finally broke. She cried into the chest of a Mafia boss while his son watched and his men secured the house, and the bodies of 3 dead Russians cooled on the floor. She cried for her mother, for her lost innocence, for the girl she'd been 4 days ago who thought the world was simple and choices were clear. And Alessandro held her through it all. This man who'd killed 3 people without hesitation, who'd built an empire on violence, who should have been a monster, but in that moment felt like the only solid thing in a world that had turned to chaos. When she finally stopped crying, Alessandro pulled back and looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. "You stood between them and my son. Again. You could have run, you could have hidden, but you stayed. Why do you keep doing that?" Maria wiped her eyes, trying to find her voice. "Because someone has to. Because Luca deserves to be protected. Because—" She stopped, unsure how to finish. "Because what?" "Because I think maybe you're right. Maybe I am naive. Maybe I do believe that goodness matters, even in a world like this. Maybe I'm stupid enough to think that one person can make a difference, but I'd rather be naive and stupid and good than smart and safe and empty." Alessandro stared at her, and something in his expression shifted, softened, opened. "You're the bravest person I've ever met," he said quietly, "and the most dangerous. Because you make me want to be different. You make me want to be the kind of man who deserves someone like you. And that's terrifying." Before Maria could respond, before she could process what he just said, more of his men arrived and the moment shattered. Alessandro stepped back, his armor sliding back into place, and he was the Don again, barking orders, securing his house, planning retaliation. But as he left, he looked back at Maria one more time, and in that look was a promise, or maybe a warning, or maybe both. The attack changed everything. The next morning, Alessandro called a meeting with his top men, and Maria, to her surprise, was invited. She sat in the corner of the war room, trying to be invisible again, but Alessandro kept glancing at her, like her presence mattered, like her opinion counted. "The Volkovs have declared war," he said, his voice cold and controlled. "They came into my home. They tried to kill my son. They threatened someone under my protection. This ends now. We hit them hard, we hit them fast, and we don't stop until they're gone." The men around the table nodded, eager for violence, hungry for revenge. But then a voice spoke up, quiet but clear. "Or you could negotiate." Everyone turned to stare at Maria, including Alessandro. She immediately regretted speaking, but it was too late to take it back. "Negotiate?" One of the men, a scarred veteran named Marco, laughed. "With all due respect, miss, you don't understand how this world works." "Maybe I don't," Maria said, her voice stronger now. "But I understand that violence breeds violence. You kill them, they kill you, back and forth until everyone is dead. What if there's another way?" "There is no other way," Marco said. But Alessandro held up a hand, silencing him. "Let her speak." Maria took a breath. "What if you offered them something they wanted more than territory? What if you found a way to end this without more bloodshed? I'm not saying forgive them, I'm saying maybe there's a solution that doesn't involve more funerals." The room was silent. Then Marco spoke again, his voice dripping with contempt. "This is what happens when you let civilians into our business. They think the world runs on fairy tales and happy endings." "Enough!" Alessandro's voice cut through the room like a blade. He looked at Maria, and she couldn't read his expression. "You think I should negotiate with the people who tried to kill my son? Who came into my home? Who threatened you?" Maria met his eyes. I think you should do whatever lets you sleep at night. But I also think that maybe, just maybe, there's been enough death. Alessandro stared at her for a long moment, and Maria was certain she'd crossed the line, certain she'd be sent away or worse. But then he turned to his men. Set up a meeting with Volkov. Tell him I want to talk. The room erupted in protests, but Alessandro silenced them with a look. I said, set up the meeting, we'll negotiate, but we'll also be ready for war. If they want peace, we'll give them peace. If they want blood, we'll drown them in it. Either way, this ends. As the meeting dispersed, Alessandro approached Maria. You just convinced me to do something I've never done in 30 years. Negotiate with an enemy who attacked my family. I hope you're right about this. What if I'm not? Maria asked, suddenly terrified of the responsibility. Then a lot of people will die, and it will be on both of us. He paused. But I'm willing to take that risk, because you make me want to try. You make me want to believe there's another way, and that's either the best thing that's ever happened to me, or the thing that will finally destroy me. He walked away, leaving Maria standing in the war room, wondering what she'd just done, wondering if compassion was really a weapon or just a way to get everyone killed. And as she stood there, surrounded by maps and guns and the machinery of violence, she realized something terrifying. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer safe. She was part of this world now, whether she wanted to be or not, and the choices she made would have consequences she couldn't predict. But here's what I want you to think about. Can compassion really change a man who's built his entire identity on violence? Can one person's goodness be enough to stop a war? Or is Maria just a naive girl playing with fire, about to get burned? Because the meeting with the Volkovs is coming, and Alessandro is trusting her judgment, and if she's wrong, if her belief in negotiation and peace and the power of doing the right thing is just a fairy tale like Marco said, then everyone she cares about will pay the price. So what do you think? Is Maria a hero or a fool? Is Alessandro changing or just pretending? And can love really bloom in a world built on blood? If you're as invested in this story as I am, if you need to know whether Maria's gamble pays off or destroys everything, then do me a favor right now. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me what you think Maria should do, and subscribe because the next part of this story is going to blow your mind. The meeting with the Volkovs is coming, secrets are going to be revealed, and Maria is about to discover that in the world of the Mafia, even peace comes with a price. Don't miss it. Subscribe now and let's find out together whether one phone call, one act of compassion, one naive maid can really change the fate of an entire city. Because I promise you, what happens next will leave you speechless. The war is coming. The question is, will it be fought with bullets or words? Stay tuned. The meeting was set for midnight in a warehouse on the edge of the city, neutral territory where blood had been spilled before and would likely be spilled again. But as Alessandro's convoy of black SUVs rolled through the empty streets, Maria sat in the back seat wondering if her words in that war room had just signed everyone's death warrant. Because here's the thing about peace, it's a lot harder to achieve than war. War is simple. War is primal. You point a gun, you pull a trigger, you eliminate the threat. But peace requires trust. And in a world built on betrayal, trust is the rarest commodity of all. So as they drove toward that warehouse, toward a meeting that could either end the violence or escalate it beyond control, Maria couldn't help but ask herself, what had she done? Alessandro sat beside her, silent, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on something she couldn't see. He'd barely spoken since they left the mansion, and Maria wondered if he was regretting listening to her, regretting bringing a naive maid into his world of blood and power Luca had wanted to come. But Alessandro had forbidden it, leaving his son under heavy guard at the mansion. So it was just Maria and Alessandro and a dozen armed men driving toward a meeting that felt less like negotiation and more like walking into a trap. You don't have to come inside, Alessandro said suddenly, his voice low. You can stay in the car. This isn't your fight. But Maria shook her head. You're doing this because of what I said, because I convinced you to try. If it goes wrong, I need to be there. I need to see it. Alessandro looked at her then, really looked at her, and Maria saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before: fear. Not for himself, but for her. If this goes bad, if they start shooting, you hit the floor and you don't move until my men get you out. Understand? I understand. I mean it, Maria. You've already saved my son's life. You've already changed mine. I won't let you die for a peace that might not even be possible. Before Maria could respond, the convoy stopped. They'd arrived. The warehouse loomed ahead, a massive structure of rusted metal and broken windows, the kind of place where deals were made and bodies were buried. Alessandro's men exited first, forming a perimeter, checking for threats, and then Alessandro stepped out, and Maria followed, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Inside, the warehouse was exactly what she'd expected. Empty, cold, lit by a few hanging bulbs that cast shadows like ghosts. And at the far end, standing with his own army of men, was Dmitry Volkov. He was older than Alessandro, maybe 60, with white hair and a face carved from granite and eyes that held no warmth, no mercy, no humanity. He looked at Alessandro with the expression of a man sizing up an opponent, and then his gaze shifted to Maria, and something like amusement flickered across his features. "You brought a woman to a war council?" Volkov's accent was thick, his English rough. "Is this the famous Maid? The one who saved your son?" "This is Maria," Alessandro said, his voice steady. "And she's the reason we're talking instead of killing each other." Volkov laughed, a sound like gravel in a blender. "Then she is either very wise or very stupid. We shall see which." The two men approached each other, stopping 10 feet apart, their armies behind them, tension so thick Maria could taste it. This was the moment. This was where peace lived or died. "You came into my home," Alessandro said, his voice cold. "You tried to kill my son. You threatened my family. Give me one reason why I shouldn't end you right here." "Because you can't," Volkov said simply. "You kill me. My men kill you. Your men kill my men. Back and forth until the city runs red. We both lose. So instead, we talk. Like civilized men. Or like the animals we are pretending not to be." Alessandro's jaw tightened, but he didn't reach for his gun. "What do you want?" "The same thing you want. Territory, money, power, respect. You control the south side. I want the docks. You give me the docks. I leave your family alone, simple business. The docks generate 40% of my revenue. You're asking me to cripple my empire. I'm asking you to choose your empire or your son, because next time we won't leave him breathing." The threat hung in the air like smoke, and Maria saw Alessandro's hand twitch toward his gun. This was it. This was where the negotiation ended and the violence began. But then Maria did something that would either save everyone or get her killed. She stepped forward. "What if there's a third option?" Every eye in the warehouse turned to her. Volkov looked amused. Alessandro looked terrified. But Maria kept talking because she'd come this far, and turning back now meant admitting that violence was the only language these men spoke. "You want the docks because they're profitable. Alessandro won't give them up because they fund his operations. But what if you shared them? What if you split the revenue 50-50 and both of you benefit? You get the money you want without the war. Alessandro keeps his empire intact, and nobody else has to die." The silence that followed was deafening. Then Volkov laughed again, but this time it sounded different, less mocking, more genuine. "The Maid thinks she can solve a blood feud with a business proposal. I like her. She has courage. Stupidity, but courage." He looked at Alessandro. "Is this really what you've become? Taking advice from servants?" "She's not a servant," Alessandro said, and his voice was hard. "She's someone who sees solutions where we only see violence. And maybe that makes her smarter than both of us." Volkov studied Alessandro for a long moment, and Maria could see him calculating, weighing options, deciding whether peace was worth more than pride. Finally, he spoke. 60-40, I get 60%, you get 40, and we split the territory. I control the North Docks, you control the South. We don't cross into each other's zones. We don't interfere with each other's business. And if either of us breaks the agreement, the deal is void and we go back to war. Take it or leave it." Alessandro looked at Maria, and in that look was a question. "Do I trust this? Do I trust you?" And Maria, who'd spent her entire life invisible, who'd never made a decision that affected more than her own survival, nodded. Because sometimes you have to believe that people are capable of more than their worst instincts. Sometimes you have to take a leap of faith, even when the ground beneath you is crumbling. Alessandro turned back to Volkov. 55, 45, and you stay away from my family, all of them, including her. Volkov glanced at Maria, then back to Alessandro, and something like understanding passed between them. You care about her, the maid. That's your weakness now. That's my strength, Alessandro said, because she makes me think before I kill, and thinking might just keep us both alive. Volkov considered this, then extended his hand. 55, 45. We have a deal. Alessandro shook it, and just like that, a war ended. Not with bullets or blood or bodies, but with a handshake and a compromise, and the naive belief of a maid who thought peace was possible. The men around them looked confused, disappointed even, like they'd been promised a fight and gotten a business meeting instead. But Maria felt something she hadn't felt in days. Hope, real, tangible hope, that maybe, just maybe, she'd been right. As they walked back to the cars, Alessandro was silent again, but this time it felt different. Less tense, more thoughtful. When they were alone in the SUV, he finally spoke. You just ended a war with a business proposal. Do you understand how insane that is? Maria smiled, the first real smile she'd managed since the attack. I understand that you listened. That's what matters. I listened because you make me want to be better. You make me believe that there's more to life than fear and power. And that's dangerous, Maria, because the more I care about you, the more vulnerable I become. And in my world, vulnerability gets you killed. Then maybe it's time to change your world. Alessandro looked at her, and in his eyes was something raw and honest and terrifying. I'm trying, because of you, but change is slow, and my enemies are patient, and I don't know if I can protect you from what's coming. What's coming? The consequences of peace, because not everyone will be happy about this deal. Some of my men think I'm weak for negotiating. Some of Volkov's men will see it as surrender. And there are other families, other players, who will see this as an opportunity to move in while we're distracted. Peace is just another kind of war, Maria. It's just fought differently. Maria felt the hope drain away, replaced by a familiar fear. So it's not over. It's never over. But maybe, for the first time in my life, I'm fighting for something other than power. Maybe I'm fighting for a future where my son doesn't have to live like I did, where people like you don't have to be invisible to survive, and that's worth more than any empire. They drove back to the mansion in silence, and when they arrived, Luca was waiting, his face anxious until he saw them both alive and whole. He hugged his father, then Maria, and for a moment they were just three people who'd survived something terrible together. Not a mafia boss and his heir, and a maid who'd stumbled into their world. But that moment couldn't last, because Alessandro was right. Peace came with consequences. Over the next 2 weeks, Maria watched as Alessandro restructured his operations, honoring the deal with Volkov, pulling back from certain territories, focusing on legitimate businesses. He was trying, really trying, to build something different. But she also saw the resentment in some of his men's eyes and heard the whispers about weakness and betrayal, and she knew that the peace they'd negotiated was fragile, held together by nothing more than two men's willingness to try and one woman's belief that it was possible. During those 2 weeks, something else happened. Alessandro and Maria grew closer, not in the dramatic, explosive way of movies, but in the quiet, gradual way of real life. He'd find excuses to talk to her, to ask her opinion on things that had nothing to do with business. She'd catch him watching her with an expression that made her heart race, and slowly, carefully, the walls he'd built around himself began to crack. One evening he found her in the garden, the same garden where she'd once trimmed hedges as an invisible maid. Now she sat on a bench watching the sunset, and he sat beside her without asking permission. My wife used to love this garden, he said quietly. She'd spend hours here, planting flowers, talking to them like they could hear her. After she died, I couldn't come here. It hurt too much. But you've made it feel less like a graveyard and more like a place where things can grow again. Maria didn't know what to say to that, so she just sat with him in the fading light, and that seemed to be enough. I need to tell you something, Alessandro said. Your mother, I've been paying for her treatment, not just for a year, for as long as she needs it. And I've set up an account for you, enough money that you never have to work again if you don't want to. You're free, Maria. You can leave, go back to your village, live your life. You don't owe me anything. Maria's throat tightened. Why are you telling me this? Because I need you to know that staying is a choice, not an obligation, not a debt. If you stay, it's because you want to. And if you leave, I'll understand. I'll even be grateful, because it means you'll be safe from this world. Maria looked at him, at this man who'd killed people, who'd built an empire on fear, who should have been a monster but somehow wasn't. What if I don't want to be safe? What if I want to stay and see what happens next? Alessandro met her eyes, and in them she saw hope and fear and something that looked dangerously close to love. Then I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of that choice, and I'll probably fail. But I'll try, because you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. You've given me a reason to be better. He stood then and walked away, leaving Maria alone in the garden with a choice that would define the rest of her life. Stay in this dangerous, complicated world with a man who was trying to change, or leave and return to the safety of invisibility. And as she sat there, watching the last light fade from the sky, she realized something important. She'd spent her entire life being invisible because she thought it kept her safe. But safety wasn't the same as living. And for the first time, she wanted to live. Really live, even if it meant risking everything. 6 months later, Maria stood in that same garden, but everything was different. Her mother had recovered and moved to the city, living in a small house Alessandro had bought for her. Luca was back at university, studying business, planning a future that didn't involve violence. The peace with Volkov had held, fragile but real, and Alessandro had slowly, painfully, begun transforming his empire, moving away from the darkest parts of his business, trying to build something his son could inherit without shame. It wasn't perfect. There were still threats, still violence, still moments when Maria wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. But there were also moments of unexpected joy, dinners with Luca and Alessandro, where they laughed like a real family. Quiet evenings in the garden where Alessandro would tell her about his dreams for a different future. And slowly, carefully, a relationship built not on power or obligation, but on genuine care and respect and the fragile hope that people could change. Alessandro never said he loved her. Men like him didn't know how, but he showed it in 1,000 small ways. The way he made sure she was protected, the way he asked her opinion and actually listened, the way he looked at her like she was the most important person in his world, and Maria, who'd spent her life invisible, finally felt seen. So here's where the story ends, or maybe where it really begins. Because Maria Alvarez, the maid from the slums who made one phone call that changed everything, proved something that the world of violence and power had forgotten. She proved that compassion isn't weakness, that one person's courage can stop a war, that even the darkest hearts can learn to feel again if someone is brave enough to show them how. She didn't save Alessandro Moretti, but she gave him a reason to save himself. And maybe that's the greatest love story of all. Not about rescuing someone, but about believing in them enough that they find the strength to change. The phone call changed everything, but it was what came after. The choice to stay, the courage to believe, the willingness to see the human beneath the monster, that really mattered. Because in the end, we're all just one choice away from becoming someone different, one phone call away from changing our entire world. The question is, are we brave enough to answer? Now I want to hear from you, really hear from you. Drop a comment right now and tell me. Would you have answered that phone call? Would you have stayed in Alessandro's world or run back to safety? Do you believe people like him can really change? Or is Maria just fooling herself? And what would you have done differently? I read every single comment, and your answers might just inspire the next story. So don't just watch, engage, comment, share this video with someone who believes in second chances, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because I've got more stories like this. Stories about impossible choices and dangerous love, and the power of one person to change everything. This is just the beginning. Let's keep this conversation going. What's your story? What phone call changed your life? Tell me in the comments. I'm listening.